The quickest way to measure a person's character is to watch how they treat someone they believe cannot change their future. A cold drizzle settled over downtown Portland as the afternoon crowd hurried through busy sidewalks carrying umbrellas and steaming coffee cups. Inside Maple and Oak Bistro, warm ember lights reflected across polished wooden floors while the comforting aroma of fresh bread and roasted coffee welcomed every guest who stepped through the front door. The restaurant had earned a reputation for elegant service and loyal customers, especially local business leaders and city officials who often gathered there for lunch meetings. Every table near the windows was filled with conversations, gentle laughter, and the quiet rhythm of silverware against porcelain plates. Olivia Carter moved confidently between the crowded tables wearing her neatly pressed waitress uniform and a crisp white apron tied carefully around her waist. At 29 years old, she had become one of the restaurant's fastest servers, admired for her efficiency and professionalism. Yet the pressure of serving demanding guests had slowly changed something inside her. Without realizing it, she had begun judging people before they ever spoke a single word. Expensive watches often received brighter smiles. Designer suits usually received quicker attention. Those small habits had quietly become part of her routine. At exactly 12:43 in the afternoon, the restaurant door opened once again. A man in his late 40s stepped inside carrying an old canvas messenger bag with rainwater still clinging to the fabric. His dark wool coat showed signs of years of careful use, and his simple leather shoes carried the marks of long walks rather than luxury. His name was Daniel Brooks. Earlier that morning, his car had broken down several blocks away while he was driving toward an important meeting at City Hall. Rather than calling for special treatment, he had decided to walk the remaining distance and stop for lunch before continuing his day. Daniel quietly looked around the restaurant before noticing a small empty table beside the front window. He smiled politely and waited near the entrance for someone to greet him. Olivia glanced toward him for only a brief moment before immediately turning her attention toward another newly arrived couple dressed in expensive business attire. She greeted them enthusiastically, escorted them to a larger table, and handed them menus with practiced warmth. Daniel remained standing patiently, saying nothing. Nearly 2 minutes passed before Olivia finally approached him with a noticeably different expression. Her smile had become smaller, her voice flatter, and her movements more hurried. Without making eye contact, she pointed toward the smallest table beside the window. "You can sit over there if you are only having coffee," she said quickly before placing a menu on the table and walking away before Daniel had the opportunity to respond. Daniel quietly took his seat without complaint. He carefully removed a small notebook from his messenger bag and rested it beside the menu while watching rain slide gently across the restaurant windows. Around him, other guests received cheerful greetings, immediate drink refills, and friendly conversation. Daniel simply folded his hands together and waited. A young busser noticed that his water glass remained empty and quietly started walking toward the table, but Olivia gently stopped him with a subtle shake of her head before directing him toward another section of the dining room. Daniel observed the exchange without frustration. Instead, a thoughtful sadness crossed his face, not because he had been overlooked, but because moments like these revealed truths that people rarely intended to show. Outside, the rain continued falling softly against the glass while, only a few blocks away, a motorcade carrying several city officials slowly turned toward the very restaurant where an ordinary-looking customer had just become almost invisible. Daniel Brooks remained seated beside the rain-covered window while the quiet rhythm of the restaurant continued flowing around him as though he had become part of the furniture instead of another paying customer. Soft jazz music drifted through hidden speakers, warm light reflected across polished wooden tables, and the scent of freshly baked bread filled the comfortable dining room. Guests laughed over business lunches while servers moved quickly between tables carrying steaming bowls of soup and carefully prepared entrees. Olivia Carter continued serving one table after another with remarkable efficiency, yet every time she passed Daniel's corner she found another reason to delay returning. She refilled sparkling water for guests who had barely touched their glasses, recommended expensive desserts to a family celebrating a birthday, and warmly described the chef's daily specials to a group of attorneys seated near the fireplace. Daniel quietly watched each interaction without frustration. He simply folded his hands together and waited with the same patient expression that had remained on his face since entering the restaurant. Nearly 15 minutes passed before Olivia finally approached his table carrying a small notepad. She did not smile this time. "Are you ready?" she asked quickly, glancing toward another table before Daniel could answer. Daniel looked up politely. "Yes, thank you. I would like the turkey sandwich with the house soup, and a black coffee, please." Olivia scribbled the order without writing down his request for coffee because she assumed he would probably change his mind after seeing the bill. "Anything else?" she asked. Daniel shook his head gently. "That will be perfect. Thank you." Olivia nodded briefly before walking away without another word. As she disappeared toward the kitchen, Daniel reached into his worn canvas messenger bag and removed a small leather notebook. He quietly wrote several thoughtful observations while occasionally looking around the dining room. He noticed a young father helping his daughter color on the children's menu, an elderly couple sharing a slice of pie with warm smiles, and a cook emerging from the kitchen to personally greet a regular customer. The restaurant possessed genuine warmth in many places. That made the colder moments even more disappointing. A teenage food runner soon appeared carrying Daniel's soup and sandwich. The young employee placed the plate carefully on the table before smiling politely. "I hope you enjoy your lunch, sir." Daniel returned the smile with sincere gratitude. "Thank you. I appreciate your kindness." Before the teenager could leave, Olivia approached and quietly corrected him. "Remember to prioritize the executive tables first," she whispered, believing Daniel could not hear the conversation. The young employee looked uncomfortable but simply nodded before returning toward the kitchen. Daniel took a slow sip of water, noticing that his coffee had never arrived. He chose not to remind anyone. Outside, the afternoon rain gradually became heavier as dark clouds settled across downtown Portland. Several black sport utility vehicles entered the parking area in front of the restaurant one after another, attracting curious glances from nearby pedestrians. Inside the dining room, no one paid much attention because the lunch crowd remained busy with conversations and meetings. The restaurant owner briefly stepped out of the office after receiving a phone call, quickly instructing the staff to prepare the private dining room for an important group expected within minutes. Olivia immediately straightened her uniform and checked every table setting near the reserved section. She whispered excitedly to another server that city leaders were coming for a luncheon meeting and reminded everyone that first impressions mattered. Daniel quietly continued eating his simple meal while listening without appearing interested. When he finished, he neatly folded his napkin, placed it beside the empty bowl, and looked once more through the rain-covered window. He seemed completely at peace despite receiving far less attention than almost every other guest. Moments later, the restaurant entrance opened again. Several city security officers entered first, followed by members of the mayor's staff. Conversations throughout the dining room gradually became quieter as guests recognized familiar public officials arriving together. Olivia hurried toward the entrance wearing the brightest smile she had shown all afternoon, completely unaware that within only a few moments every assumption she had made about the quiet man sitting alone beside the window would begin collapsing in front of the entire restaurant. The atmosphere inside Maple and Oak Bistro shifted almost instantly as the restaurant owner hurried toward the entrance with an expression that blended excitement and nervous anticipation. Several members of the mayor's security detail entered first, quietly scanning the dining room before stepping aside to allow the city officials inside. Conversations around the restaurant softened until only the gentle sound of rain tapping against the windows remained. Olivia Carter straightened her white apron, brushed an invisible wrinkle from her uniform, and hurried toward the entrance carrying menus with the brightest smile she had offered all afternoon. "Welcome to Maple and Oak Bistro," she said warmly. "We have your private dining room prepared." The mayor smiled politely and thanked her before glancing around the restaurant as though searching for someone. His chief of staff looked equally attentive, quietly scanning every occupied table instead of following the owner toward the reserved room. Olivia noticed the unusual behavior but assumed another important guest had not yet arrived. Daniel Brooks remained seated beside the window, calmly finishing the last few bites of his sandwich while slowly turning another page inside his small leather notebook. His untouched cup of coffee finally arrived nearly 20 minutes after he had ordered it, quietly placed on the table by the same teenage food runner who offered an apologetic smile. Daniel simply thanked him with genuine kindness before lifting the warm cup into his hands. The young employee hesitated for a brief moment. "I am sorry about the wait, sir." Daniel smiled reassuringly. "You have nothing to apologize for. Thank you for bringing it." The teenager walked away feeling unexpectedly lighter after such a simple exchange. Nearby, Olivia continued helping the restaurant owner organize the arrival of the city's leadership, unaware that the mayor had still not entered the private dining room. Instead, the mayor remained standing near the entrance, his eyes continuing to search across the dining room. Suddenly his expression brightened. Without another word he stepped away from the welcoming committee and began walking directly across the restaurant floor. Several city officials immediately followed behind him. Curious conversations stopped entirely as guests watched the unexpected procession move past expensive suites, reserved tables, and prominent local business leaders. Olivia instinctively turned to see where the mayor was going. Her confident smile slowly faded as she realized he was walking toward the quiet corner beside the rain-covered window. Daniel looked up from his notebook just as the mayor reached his table. A warm smile spread across both men's faces, the kind shared only by people who held deep mutual respect. Before anyone could understand what was happening, the mayor extended both hands toward Daniel with unmistakable admiration. "Good afternoon, boss," he said with genuine warmth. "I was hoping I would not be late." The entire restaurant became perfectly silent. The owner froze beside the private dining room entrance. Olivia remained standing only a few feet away, still holding the unused menus in trembling hands. Daniel stood calmly and shook the mayor's hands with quiet affection rather than ceremony. "You arrived exactly on time," he replied gently. "Please, do not keep everyone waiting because of me." The mayor smiled. "They can wait another minute." Turning toward the city officials behind him, he introduced Daniel with obvious respect rather than formality. "Ladies and gentlemen, before today's meeting begins, I would like you to greet the man whose guidance helped shape many of the projects our city enjoys today." Several officials immediately stepped forward, shaking Daniel's hand one after another with sincere appreciation. Guests throughout the dining room exchanged astonished glances while whispers quietly spread from table to table. Olivia felt every assumption she had made during the afternoon collapse beneath the weight of a single respectful word spoken by the mayor. She looked toward Daniel once again, remembering the worn coat, the old messenger bag, the forgotten cup of coffee, and the polite patience he had shown from the moment he entered the restaurant. For the first time that day she truly saw the man sitting at table 7. And the realization settled quietly into her heart long before anyone explained who he really was. Daniel Brooks gently invited the mayor to take the seat across from him rather than continuing the conversation in the center of the dining room. The mayor accepted with an easy smile, placing his folder on the small wooden table beside the rain-covered window as though it were the most natural place in the world to conduct an important conversation. Around them, the restaurant remained unusually quiet. Guests who had been laughing only moments earlier now watched with open curiosity, while the city officials respectfully waited several feet away. The owner of Maple and Oak Bistro stood completely motionless, still trying to understand why the city's highest elected official had walked past every distinguished guest to greet the quiet man everyone else had overlooked. Olivia Carter remained frozen beside the reception counter. The menus she still held felt unexpectedly heavy in her hands. She replayed every moment from the past hour inside her mind. She remembered pointing Daniel toward the smallest table without asking whether he had a preference. She remembered forgetting his coffee. She remembered stopping the young food runner from giving him extra attention because she believed more important customers deserved better service. None of those choices had seemed significant at the time. Together they now formed a picture she wished she had never painted. The mayor looked toward Daniel with sincere appreciation. "I hope the city has not kept you waiting too long," he said warmly. Daniel smiled gently before taking another sip of the coffee that had finally arrived. Not at all. Waiting gives people time to observe. The mayor laughed softly because he understood exactly what Daniel meant. Turning toward the restaurant owner, he said, You may not know this, but many of the educational programs, small business partnerships, and neighborhood revitalization projects our city celebrates each year would never have become reality without Daniel's guidance. Quiet whispers spread across the dining room. Several guests exchanged surprised glances while others instinctively looked back toward Daniel, searching for signs of extraordinary success. They found only the same worn coat, the weathered messenger bag, and the calm expression that had been there from the beginning. Daniel never attempted to interrupt the mayor or correct his praise. He simply listened with quiet humility. Daniel has spent years helping communities grow, the mayor continued. He rarely accepts public recognition because he believes results matter more than applause. Olivia felt her heartbeat quicken. She had assumed wealth announced itself through expensive clothing, polished shoes, and visible status. Instead, the most respected person in the room looked exactly like the quiet traveler she had nearly ignored. The restaurant owner slowly approached Daniel's table with visible embarrassment. Sir, he said carefully, I sincerely apologize if your experience today has been less than exceptional. Please allow us to prepare another meal for you. Everything will be complimentary. Daniel looked up kindly and shook his head. Thank you, but my lunch was perfectly fine. The owner looked confused. Daniel continued gently. The food was excellent. Hospitality is about something much deeper than the menu. Those words settled over the dining room with surprising weight. No accusation filled his voice. No anger appeared in his expression. The simple sentence carried enough truth that nobody felt the need to defend themselves. Olivia finally gathered the courage to walk toward the table. She stopped a respectful distance away, unable to meet Daniel's eyes immediately. Sir, she said quietly, I owe you an apology. Daniel looked at her with the same calm kindness he had shown the teenage food runner. He waited patiently without saying a word. Olivia took a slow breath. I judged you before I knew anything about you. I treated other guests differently because I assumed they mattered more. I am truly sorry. Daniel remained silent for a brief moment before offering a gentle smile. Thank you for saying that. Olivia expected disappointment or criticism, but neither came. His response was simple, almost peaceful. The mayor quietly observed the exchange without interrupting. He knew Daniel well enough to understand that the greatest lessons rarely arrived through lectures. They arrived through thoughtful questions asked at exactly the right moment. Outside the restaurant, the steady rain finally began to fade as soft afternoon sunlight slowly pushed through the gray clouds. Inside Maple and Oak Bistro, the atmosphere had changed just as completely. No one was thinking about city officials, important meetings, or public influence anymore. Every person in the room had begun reflecting upon something far more personal. They were asking themselves how many ordinary faces they had failed to truly see simply because appearance had spoken before character ever received the chance. For several quiet moments, no one inside Maple and Oak Bistro spoke. The rain outside had almost disappeared, leaving tiny drops of water clinging to the restaurant windows while soft afternoon sunlight gradually brightened the dining room. Daniel Brooks remained seated with the same calm expression he had carried from the moment he entered. The mayor finally pulled out the chair across from him and sat down with relaxed familiarity rather than formal ceremony. Several city officials followed his example, taking nearby seats instead of moving into the reserved private dining room. The unexpected decision surprised the restaurant owner, who immediately offered to prepare the executive dining area. The mayor smiled politely and shook his head. This table is perfectly fine, he said. Some of our most important conversations have happened in places much simpler than this. Daniel quietly laughed. Comfort often makes people forget to be honest. The mayor nodded in agreement. Exactly. Their conversation sounded less like an official meeting and more like two longtime friends exchanging thoughtful ideas. Olivia watched from several feet away while helping another server refill water glasses. She noticed something she had completely missed earlier. Every city official greeted Daniel with genuine warmth rather than cautious respect. None attempted to impress him. None treated him like a celebrity. Instead, they listened carefully whenever he spoke, often smiling before answering. Whatever influence Daniel possessed had clearly been earned through years of trust instead of authority. The restaurant owner approached the table carrying a fresh pot of coffee. This time he personally filled Daniel's cup before serving anyone else. Daniel thanked him kindly without showing satisfaction or resentment. His gratitude remained exactly the same as when the teenage food runner had delivered the delayed coffee earlier. That quiet consistency affected Olivia more deeply than any criticism could have. Curiosity slowly spread among the restaurant guests. A retired school principal sitting near the fireplace quietly recognized Daniel and whispered something to her husband. Within moments, several nearby diners realized they had seen his photograph years earlier during community education projects and neighborhood development programs. One guest softly explained that Daniel had quietly funded scholarships for students whose families could not afford college tuition. Another remembered reading that he had helped save several historic neighborhoods from being replaced by commercial developments. Yet almost nobody had recognized him because he had never placed his own name at the center of those achievements. The mayor eventually looked around the restaurant before speaking loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Daniel has always believed leadership begins by listening before speaking. Daniel smiled modestly. Most people already know the answers they need. Sometimes they simply need someone willing to hear them. The mayor nodded thoughtfully. That lesson has helped me more times than I can count. Olivia felt another wave of regret settle quietly over her. She realized she had never truly listened to Daniel from the moment he arrived. She had looked at his worn coat, his weathered messenger bag, and his ordinary appearance before deciding who he must be. She had formed an entire opinion without asking a single genuine question. The realization felt painful precisely because it was true. As the conversation continued, Daniel reached into his old messenger bag and carefully removed a thin folder containing several handwritten notes. Maps, sketches, and community improvement ideas filled the pages. The mayor leaned forward with genuine interest while several officials joined the discussion. There were no expensive presentation slides, no polished marketing materials, and no dramatic speeches. Only thoughtful ideas written in careful handwriting by someone who cared deeply about improving the lives of others. Olivia quietly watched as Daniel explained a proposal for expanding after-school programs through partnerships between local businesses and neighborhood libraries. Every suggestion focused upon helping ordinary families rather than attracting recognition. His voice remained calm, humble, and practical. The restaurant owner stood nearby listening in respectful silence. He gradually understood that the most influential person inside his restaurant had arrived carrying nothing more impressive than an old bag filled with handwritten ideas and a quiet desire to serve others. Daniel finally closed the folder and looked toward the large front windows where sunlight now reflected across the wet sidewalk outside. Communities become stronger, he said gently, when people begin seeing value before they begin measuring status. No one immediately answered. The simple sentence settled softly across every table inside the restaurant. Olivia lowered her eyes for a brief moment, realizing that the lesson she had received that afternoon reached far beyond hospitality. It reached into every ordinary moment when one human being chooses whether to see another person with judgment or with dignity. The conversation at the small table beside the window gradually came to a natural pause as city officials gathered their notes and prepared for the afternoon meeting. The mayor stood and thanked Daniel Brooks once again before quietly reminding everyone that the meeting could wait another few minutes. Some lessons are more valuable than any agenda, he said with a warm smile. Several officials nodded in agreement before stepping respectfully toward the private dining room. Their voices remained soft, their movements unhurried, as though the atmosphere inside Maple and Oak Bistro had become too meaningful to disturb. Daniel remained seated for another moment, slowly closing his worn leather notebook before placing it carefully inside his weathered messenger bag. He looked around the dining room one final time. Guests had returned to their conversations, but something subtle had changed. Servers moved with greater awareness. The young food runner smiled more confidently while helping an elderly couple carry their takeout bags. Even the restaurant owner personally greeted new arrivals instead of remaining behind the reception desk. Small changes had already begun quietly unfolding. Olivia Carter stood near the beverage station, uncertain whether she should approach Daniel again. She had apologized, yet something inside her told her that words alone were not enough. Taking a slow breath, she finally walked toward his table. Daniel looked up and welcomed her with the same calm expression he had shown throughout the afternoon. "May I sit for just a moment?" Olivia asked softly. Daniel nodded toward the empty chair across from him. She carefully sat down, folding her hands together while searching for the right words. "I have been thinking about everything that happened today," she admitted. "The truth is that I did not only judge you. I have been judging people for a long time without realizing it." Daniel listened quietly without interrupting. "Working here has become so busy," Olivia continued. "Somewhere along the way I started believing that expensive clothes, luxury watches, and important titles told me who deserved my best service. I never stopped to question those assumptions." Daniel gently rested both hands on the table. His voice remained calm, almost reflective. "May I ask you one question?" Olivia nodded immediately. Daniel looked briefly toward the rain-washed window before returning his attention to her. "If I had truly been a man with very little money, wearing the same coat, carrying the same bag, and walking through that door after my car broke down, would I have deserved any less kindness?" Olivia lowered her eyes. The answer came instantly, but saying it aloud felt difficult because she already understood its weight. "No," she whispered. "You would have deserved exactly the same respect." Daniel smiled gently. "Then today was never really about me." Those simple words settled into the quiet space between them. Olivia slowly looked up again. Daniel continued speaking with remarkable gentleness. "Status changes. Wealth changes. Positions change. Every person eventually experiences seasons when life becomes easier or harder. If our kindness depends upon circumstances, then it was never truly kindness." Olivia felt tears gathering in her eyes, not from embarrassment but from recognition. She remembered elderly customers who had counted every dollar before paying. She remembered construction workers arriving in dusty boots after long shifts. She remembered travelers eating alone because business had taken them far from their families. She realized that every one of them had carried a story she had never bothered to imagine. Daniel reached for the coffee cup that had finally been served so late. It had grown almost cold. He smiled quietly before taking one final sip anyway. "Cold coffee still tastes like coffee," he said with a gentle laugh. "Sometimes people deserve patience just as much." Olivia could not help smiling through her emotion. The tension that had filled the restaurant earlier had completely disappeared. The restaurant owner quietly approached the table but remained several feet away, allowing the conversation to finish naturally. Daniel stood, placed enough money on the table to cover the meal and a generous tip for the entire service team, then carefully lifted his old messenger bag onto his shoulder. Before leaving, he looked once more at Olivia. "You have something far more valuable than experience," he said kindly. "You have the ability to change. Never lose that." With those words, he walked calmly toward the entrance where the mayor waited beside the open door. Soft afternoon sunlight now filled the street outside as the last rain clouds drifted away above Portland. Olivia watched Daniel step onto the sidewalk beside the city's highest elected official, yet the image that remained in her heart was not of an influential advisor walking beside the mayor. It was of an ordinary man who had quietly reminded an entire restaurant that the greatest measure of character is how we treat the people who can offer us nothing in return. The following Monday morning felt surprisingly different inside Maple and Oak Bistro. Nothing about the restaurant itself had changed. The polished wooden floors still reflected the warm morning sunlight, the scent of fresh pastries drifted from the kitchen, and soft piano music once again welcomed the first customers of the day. Yet the people inside the building carried themselves differently, as though the quiet events of the previous week had left an invisible reminder hanging gently in the air. Olivia Carter arrived nearly 30 minutes earlier than usual. Before changing into her uniform, she stood alone inside the empty dining room looking toward the small table beside the front window where Daniel Brooks had quietly eaten his lunch. The chair remained exactly where it had been. The coffee cups had long since been washed and returned to the kitchen. No physical evidence remained, yet she could still remember every word of their conversation with remarkable clarity. She slowly tied the strings of her clean white apron behind her back and whispered a quiet promise to herself. Every guest. Every time. She repeated the words once more before beginning her shift. Later that morning, the restaurant owner gathered the entire service team before opening the front doors. Employees expected another discussion about customer satisfaction scores or lunch reservations, but instead he spoke about something entirely different. Last week reminded me that hospitality is never about deciding who deserves excellent service, he said thoughtfully. Our responsibility is to offer every guest the same respect before we know anything about them. No one interrupted. Several employees quietly nodded because they had witnessed exactly what had happened. The teenage food runner smiled slightly after hearing those words. Olivia listened with complete attention, understanding that the message applied to her more deeply than anyone else. Before dismissing the staff, the owner introduced a simple new practice. Every new employee would spend part of orientation learning that genuine hospitality begins with curiosity instead of assumption. Team members would greet every guest warmly before noticing clothing, appearance, or perceived social status. It sounded almost obvious, yet everyone understood how easily those simple principles could disappear during busy days. As the restaurant opened, customers gradually filled the dining room once again. An elderly man wearing faded work clothes entered carrying a small toolbox. In the past, Olivia might have seated him near the back without much thought. Instead, she walked directly toward him with a sincere smile. "Good morning," she said warmly. "Please choose any table you would enjoy." The man looked pleasantly surprised before selecting a seat beside the front window. Olivia immediately brought fresh coffee and patiently described the breakfast specials without rushing a single word. A few minutes later, a young mother entered carrying a sleeping baby while balancing a diaper bag on one shoulder. Before being asked, Olivia gently helped move an extra chair to create more space beside the table. She quietly offered warm water for preparing baby formula and assured the mother there was no need to hurry. The grateful smile she received felt far more meaningful than the generous tips she once chased so eagerly. Throughout the following weeks, similar moments quietly accumulated. Construction workers, college students, retired teachers, delivery drivers, business executives, tourists, and families all received exactly the same welcoming smile. Olivia gradually discovered something unexpected. Treating everyone equally did not make her work more difficult. It made every day more meaningful. Customers noticed the difference as well. Online reviews increasingly praised the restaurant's atmosphere rather than simply its menu. Guests often mentioned feeling genuinely welcome from the moment they entered. The restaurant owner quietly framed one particular review and placed it inside the employee break room. It read, "You may arrive here as a stranger, but you never feel treated like one." Olivia paused to read those words almost every afternoon before beginning the lunch rush. They reminded her of the lesson Daniel had left behind without ever intending to become anyone's teacher. One cool autumn afternoon, the teenage food runner approached Olivia while polishing silverware. "You seem happier lately," he said with a smile. Olivia laughed softly before looking toward the familiar table beside the window. "I finally realized that serving food is only part of this job," she answered. "The other part is making sure every person who walks through that door feels seen." Outside, golden leaves drifted gently along the sidewalk as another ordinary day unfolded. Inside Maple and Oak Bistro, dozens of quiet acts of kindness passed almost unnoticed, yet together they slowly transformed the restaurant into the kind of place where people remembered not only what they ate, but how they had been made to feel from the very first hello. Nearly 8 months passed before anyone inside Maple and Oak Bistro realized how deeply one ordinary afternoon had changed the identity of the restaurant itself. Guests no longer recommended the cafe simply because of its homemade bread or carefully prepared meals. They spoke about something far more difficult to measure. They remembered the warmth of the welcome, the patience of the servers, and the quiet feeling that every person who entered was treated as though they genuinely mattered. Local newspapers even mentioned the restaurant, while highlighting small businesses that strengthened the community through exceptional customer service rather than expensive advertising. The owner accepted the recognition with quiet gratitude because he knew the greatest transformation had not happened in the kitchen. It had happened inside the hearts of the people serving each table. Olivia Carter gradually became the employee most often praised by returning customers. Business executives appreciated her professionalism, but so did delivery drivers arriving late in the afternoon, retired couples enjoying coffee together, and college students sharing inexpensive lunches between classes. She greeted each person with the same calm smile, the same welcoming voice, and the same attentive respect. Several new employees quietly began copying her example without realizing why it felt so natural. One bright spring afternoon, the restaurant owner called Olivia into his office after the lunch rush had ended. Sunlight streamed through the windows while framed photographs of the restaurant's earliest days decorated the walls. The owner placed a folder on the desk before looking at her with genuine appreciation. "You have changed more than your own approach to hospitality," he said. "You have quietly influenced everyone around you." Olivia smiled modestly. "I simply try to remember that every guest carries a story I cannot see." The owner nodded. "Exactly. That is why I would like you to become our hospitality trainer for every new employee who joins this restaurant." Olivia looked surprised. "Me? Yes," he answered. "Policies teach procedures. People teach culture." She accepted the responsibility with quiet humility, understanding that leadership often begins through example rather than position. During her first training session, she gathered 5 newly hired servers around the very table beside the front window where Daniel Brooks had once quietly eaten lunch. The chair remained unchanged, but its meaning had become something entirely different. Olivia did not mention Daniel's name. Instead, she asked a simple question. "How do you decide who deserves your best service?" The new employees exchanged uncertain glances before one young server answered carefully. "Every guest should receive the same service." Olivia smiled warmly. "That sounds simple. The challenge is remembering those words when the restaurant becomes busy." She explained how assumptions quietly influence decisions before people even realize they are making them. She encouraged every employee to notice eye contact, tone of voice, patience, and small acts of kindness that often mattered far more than speed. Her lessons contained no dramatic speeches, only thoughtful observations gathered through personal experience. Weeks later, customer feedback continued improving. One handwritten letter especially caught everyone's attention. It came from an elderly widower who had recently begun eating lunch alone after losing his wife. He wrote that although the meal had been wonderful, what he remembered most was the young waitress who sat with him for 2 minutes after noticing he seemed lonely. He ended the letter with a single sentence. "Thank you for reminding me that I am still visible." Olivia quietly folded the letter after reading it, and placed it inside the training binder used for every new employee. She believed those words explained hospitality more clearly than any instruction manual ever could. Outside, another season gradually unfolded across Portland as flowering trees lined the city streets and afternoon sunshine replaced the gray skies of winter. Inside Maple and Oak Bistro, ordinary conversations, warm greetings, and thoughtful gestures continued shaping lives in ways no one could fully measure. Customers arrived carrying briefcases, backpacks, grocery bags, work boots, elegant suits, and everyday worries. Yet every person who crossed the front doorway encountered the same welcoming smile before anyone noticed clothing, occupation, or circumstance. Olivia often paused for a quiet moment at the end of each shift while looking toward the familiar table beside the window. She understood that the greatest gift Daniel Brooks had left behind was not a lesson about wealth or influence. It was the understanding that genuine respect becomes meaningful only when it is offered freely to those who have not yet given us any reason except their shared humanity. 5 years quietly passed, and Maple and Oak Bistro became known throughout Portland for something that could never be listed on a menu or measured by a balance sheet. Travelers recommended the restaurant because they felt welcomed. Families returned because their children were remembered by name. Elderly guests often stayed longer than planned because someone always found time for a genuine conversation. Business leaders appreciated the professionalism, while construction workers, delivery drivers, teachers, and students received exactly the same warmth. Without realizing it, the small restaurant had become an example of how ordinary kindness could quietly transform an entire community. Olivia Carter had grown into the restaurant's hospitality director, mentoring every new employee who joined the team. Her office remained modest, containing little more than a desk, a bookshelf filled with customer letters, and one framed handwritten sentence hanging beside the window. It simply read, "Every guest. Every time." She looked at those words each morning before stepping onto the dining room floor, reminding herself that true leadership begins with the example people quietly witness rather than the instructions they hear. One cool autumn afternoon, as golden leaves drifted gently along the sidewalks outside, the front door opened once again. A man wearing a familiar dark wool coat entered carrying the same weathered canvas messenger bag that had quietly changed so many lives years earlier. Daniel Brooks paused near the entrance, allowing another elderly couple to walk inside ahead of him before he stepped across the threshold. Time had added a few strands of silver to his hair, but the calm kindness in his eyes remained exactly the same. Before he had taken more than 2 steps into the dining room, a young server approached with a warm smile. "Good afternoon. Welcome to Maple and Oak Bistro. Please choose any table you would enjoy." Daniel thanked him kindly and smiled toward the familiar table beside the front window. "If it is available, I would love to sit there again." "Of course," the young server replied happily. "It is one of our favorite spots." Moments later, Olivia looked up while carrying 2 cups of coffee toward another table. The instant she recognized Daniel, her face brightened with genuine joy rather than surprise. She finished helping her guests before walking calmly toward him. "Welcome back," she said warmly. "It is wonderful to see you again." Daniel stood and shook her hand with the same quiet respect he had always shown. "It is wonderful to be here again." Olivia smiled. "Your favorite black coffee will be ready in just a moment." Daniel laughed softly. "You remembered. Some lessons should never be forgotten," she replied. This time the coffee arrived before he even opened the menu. The young server carefully placed the warm cup on the table and wished him a pleasant afternoon with sincere enthusiasm. Daniel thanked him exactly as he had thanked the teenage food runner years earlier. Watching the interaction unfold, Olivia quietly realized something remarkable. The young employee had never met Daniel before. He did not know about the mayor, the community projects, or the events that had changed the restaurant's culture. He was simply treating another guest with genuine respect because that had become the natural way everyone worked. Daniel spent the next hour enjoying a simple lunch while observing the dining room. He watched a server patiently help a visually impaired guest read the menu. Another employee carried coloring books to 2 young children before their parents even asked. An elderly veteran received a warm greeting from nearly every member of the staff as he entered. None of these moments were extraordinary by themselves. Together they revealed something far more meaningful than a single dramatic event ever could. As Daniel prepared to leave, the restaurant owner joined Olivia near the entrance. "You gave us a lesson we never expected," he said quietly. Daniel gently shook his head. "No. Your people chose to learn it. That is what made the difference." Outside, the afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the quiet street, while autumn leaves danced gently in the cool breeze. Daniel paused for one final look through the restaurant window. Inside, laughter, conversation, and small acts of kindness continued without anyone realizing they were creating memories that guests would carry long after the meal had ended. Daniel smiled peacefully before walking away, knowing that the greatest success in life is never measured by how many important people recognize our name, but by how many ordinary people feel respected simply because they crossed our path. And inside Maple and Oak Bistro, every welcoming smile quietly proved that genuine dignity is never reserved for the powerful. It belongs equally to every person who walks through the door.